How much damage do you need? Well, it's pretty subjective, honestly. Pretty much everyone's going to feel very different at varying amounts of damage. So take my suggestion with a grain of salt. Some people prefer high damage, low defense builds. Others prefer inverse. I like a little bit of a middle ground, okay? I like something that's definitely not going to get one shot all the time, a cast on death portal build, but also obviously not a ZTPS build. I don't want these rats spamming ZTPS in my chat. Go ahead, try it, see what happens, right? How much damage do you need for white maps? It's really quick, almost none. Literally every decent ability coming out of the campaign with a 4-link and leveled gems, and maybe, you know, like a weapon that has 1 or 2 damage mods on it will be able to do white maps, and through white maps and the leveling of their gems, maybe a few upgrades, a couple levels up on their character, you know, some extra passives, they'll have enough damage for yellow maps too. But the block comes at red maps, and especially red maps with their higher tier of detrimental modifiers, right? I don't know why I quoted that, but red maps, when you get reduced aura effect, it's a lot stronger on a red map than it is on a white map. A lot of these mods ramp really hard, so that's another thing that's kind of working against you. You also have altars working against you, you know, like on top of expedition remnants, and now essences are higher, and you know, the monsters, they deal more damage because they're a higher level, and because of the mods, and because of everything else, and you know, the altars and everything, it kind of becomes a little bit of a wall for people. So how much damage do you need for red maps? Well, generally it's kind of just been a rule of thumb for quite some time now, but as far as consistent damage goes, so like .DPS, it's going to be like 2 million. So for that 2 million though, what does it mean to have consistent damage? Well, so let's have a build like Cold Dot Elementalist, my Cold Dot, and then Bone Shatter. So Bone Shatter has to put 2 totems down, pop focus cooldown, make sure they have blood rage up, and make sure they're starting the fight with, you know, 25 or more rage, and then press berserk, you know, depending on how much damage they're doing, so that they have berserk only as long as the boss is alive, right? So that's kind of just like a little bit of a vibe check. You wouldn't press berserk right away if you have low damage, because now you're losing the attack speed from rage, yada yada yada. So this is a variable amount of damage. It's not consistent. Your damage is going to go up and down depending on what buffs are up and whether or not the boss killed your totems, whether you forgot to press focus, or you went into the fight without rage because you liked pressing berserk while you're mapping. It's going to feel a lot worse if you're not prepared on a build like that, you know, especially if you're capping out, right? With all your buffs, you're capping out at 2 million. You have to make sure you have everything for that boss fight, or it's going to feel bad. Whereas with like my Cold Dot, man, you just like, you press your Cold Snap, you press your Creeping Frost, you press your Vol Cold Snap, and then you stand on the boss with Vortex. And then you put an Arcanist Brand down. And while the buttons are still, you know, comparable, you have like 5-ish, 6-ish buttons on each of these builds for the damage on the boss. It's going to feel a lot better on Cold Dot because the damage will be consistent as soon as you get your like buffs up, right? You have your brand down and everything, and now the boss is always going to be taking that .DPS. There's not a point where you're moving in that fight as a melee character or range character to dodge abilities, and now you are not dealing any damage. You are always dealing damage with these dot builds, and this is even more so with stuff like Ignite. Ignite feels really, really nice because Ignite generally doesn't have like too many other crazy buttons with it, right? With Cold Dot, you have like 4 freaking abilities that you're like stacking. With Ignite, you know, you have your Ignite ability, and then you have your Arcanist Brand set up, and you might have like a Self Curse or one other utility as well. But yeah, dot builds are kind of the king and the standard when it comes to damage. It'll be what I talk about. It's not to say that you won't have enough damage on other things. It's just really easy to say .DPS because it'll be consistent, and it's a good standard to set. So 2 mil .DPS will be my standard, as that's about when it's, you know, you're starting to be comfortable. 2 mil .DPS, still kind of low, to be honest, right? But you know, it's doable. It's absolutely doable if it's a consistent 2 million .DPS. Now you can like be boosted to this, like I said, with Berserk and all of that, but you just want to make sure that you're keeping all of that boosting to your 2 million for the boss, right? So you press Berserk maybe once or twice during the map, and you always make sure you have it on Bone Shatter when you're going to the boss. So that's for like T14, T16s. That is like a bare minimum. That is a bare minimum. I generally won't look at builds that can't reach that with no gear at all, with very little gear, I should say, not no gear at all, right? With a little bit of gearing, some Eldritch Implicits, a few damage mods, and a couple crafts on your gear, as well as being like level 85 to 90, something like that. You should be able to hit 2 million DPS on any of the decent league starters and a lot of the meta abilities, right? All of them pretty much, or they probably wouldn't be meta. So what about bosses, right? You know, red maps, it's really not that much. 2 million is really easy to hit on a lot of meta abilities, but for bossing, a lot of people ask me, you know, how much damage do I need for this boss? Or do you think I'm ready for this boss? And the thing is, you really don't need anything more than 2 million DPS for the whole game. Now, obviously for Sims 30s or something like that, I don't include that. But, you know, as far as just the bosses go, the non-Uber bosses, they're all doable on 2 million DPS. They're probably doable on a lot less than that, but that's because they're all skill checks. Every boss in the game, how much damage do you need? Well, it all depends on how good you are. For me, I used to be god awful at these bosses. So the amount of damage I needed was way higher because I only had 6 portals. And if a boss does an ability I don't know how to counter, or I can't move out of the way of, well, now I lose a portal and I'm gonna need enough damage to kill that boss before I lose the next 5 to that same exact move. So TLDR here is how much damage you need for bosses. Well, honestly, just to get better at the bosses and you won't need as much damage, right? I recommend you to just, if you're bad at Uber Elder, and you know, it's late in the league, just buy 5 sets to do Uber Elder with, right? If you are bad at Maven, just buy 5 Mavens, and even the dumbest of you will learn at least 1 or 2 abilities and how to counter them, or you'll at least be on your way to doing that, right? Like Maven does her memory game. You're getting more comfortable with that. Uber Elder has those little squids that spawn in the corner. Maybe now you notice them after, geez, man, hopefully after 5 sets, you notice the squid spawning in the corner, put down that goopy black stuff. They poop that stuff out, and you got to kill them before they do that all over the arena. So yeah, bosses, they're pretty much just a skill check. Now, for Uber bosses, you might think, dang, dude, there's an Uber boss. I need so much more damage. I need to be able to just kill these very quickly. No, dude, people do Uber bosses on super low damage builds all the time because even the Uber bosses are generally skill checks. This is not for Uber Cyrus though, okay? Uber Cyrus, ugh, get out of here, dude. God, Uber Cyrus is just gonna put his D-gen everywhere all over the arena, and you're gonna need a little bit more damage to make that comfortable. But I think when we were doing the 10 div Uber challenge, I did it on like Flame Wall, and all the bosses, I did them, some deathless, others not. I think there was a few deathless. I think I did Uber Cyrus deathless even, but I only had like 4 million Uber DPS against that boss. Now, Uber boss DPS is different because Uber bosses inherently take 70% less damage. So for you to have like a doable amount of damage, you'll want like a normal 7 million DPS. So it's at least like 2 million something. And that's generally what I did for the challenge. I always tried to have at least 2 million Uber DPS when it came to dot builds. And I found that generally made them very doable. Now, I still wiped on some of those bosses, but it was more so just because of the weird, gimmicky, random build that I was doing. That was just bad. Or I was just not yet completely familiar with the boss, right? There's very few things when it comes to bosses where it's like, oh man, I'm getting gapped by my gear versus getting gapped by your skill, right? Uber bosses, very skillful. But yeah, I mean, who would have figured, man? If you learn the boss abilities, then you could do the bosses. Anyways, for Delirium, it gets a little bit different. This is the one spot where I actually would recommend you to have a lot more damage. 2 million is like the baseline. Obviously for mapping, you will want more. But as far as a baseline for 80 Deli maps, I found on Vortex Ignite, and this is an Ignite build, so it's a little bit different. 4 million DPS was starting to feel, or not starting to feel, it was pretty comfortable actually. I was farming pretty hard on 4 million DPS. Now this was skipping Omniphobia and Causus when they spawned and Beyond bosses because they just took too long and they weren't dropping like anything. That's good, right? A Beyond boss, maybe you get lucky and you get a Tainted Mythic Orb or Tainted Fusing. But as far as Omniphobia Causus, it just wasn't worth it that league. None of the jewels were worth anything, and Sim Splinters, like a full Simulacrum was 30 chaos. So it's literally like, why are you ever killing those bosses if they don't get one shot? You just like kill all the monsters, pick up the loot, and like run away, right? You just like eat the attacks and run away. Oh, whatever. So 4 million DPS was nice for that, including skipping the bosses. But if you reach like 8 million Ignite DPS or on Corrupting Fever, I was having like no problem just like deleting those bosses with Reap and all of that. It's a lot better and it's a lot more comfortable. So 80% Delirium is about, you know, 4 million plus 8 million to be super, super comfy. But generally, as a rule of thumb, if you're hitting like 10 million sustained DPS or just sustained damage in general, the entire game should be opened up to you as long as you have like a reasonable amount of defenses. Just because it's already going to be doable on 2, it's going to be a lot faster on 5, right? That difference is pretty huge, going from 2 to 5 million damage, you know, just for your mapping and for your bossing. Once you hit like 10, especially when you're getting like 20 or 30, the whole game is just starting to die before you ever have to learn more than like one move or have to get out of the way of like one thing, especially even on like bosses and whatnot, right? Like, dude, if you're like 20, 30, some people really like to play that way, honestly. A lot of people want even more damage than that. I don't know why, but they want more than 30 million damage. It's fun. I do know why. Okay, it's fun. But also, they are compromising so much to get all of that damage. And that's something you have to keep in mind. You know, like there are builds that one-shot Uber bosses. I had like an Ice Trap guide on max roll for a bit there, where you just go in, you one-shot Uber Exarch, one-shot Searing Exarch and Uber Eater, Uber Maven you could do, and Uber Cyrus you could do. And that it's pretty fun, yeah. But then, you know, a build that's kind of that gimmicky struggles with mapping and all that. So that's a little bit of a give and take. But anyways, I hope this was a little bit of help for you to determine how much damage you need. Again, really, it's kind of just 2 million and you can go from there. Anything less than that feels really bad because 2 million is already kind of low as is, but it's doable and you can always get more damage as you buy more upgrades, right? So it's not that bad. Anyways, get good at your bosses, get at least a couple million damage and blast on. Like and subscribe and I'll see you guys in the next one. Okay, bye.